When the icy winds of World War II cut through the trenches and forests of Europe, soldiers faced an enemy far crueler than bullets: the cold. Frostbite claimed more limbs than landmines. Winter didn't just test bravery, it tested survival. But when proper winter gear ran out, soldiers turned to something you'd never expect: newspapers and ash. It sounds absurd, yet this wartime improvisation created one of the most effective, forgotten insulations ever used in battle. Across the Eastern Front and in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, soldiers were freezing in their boots. Winter in World War II wasn't just brutal, it was deadly. Temperatures plunged below zero, and supply lines froze as solid as the rivers. Armies that planned their strategies down to the last bullet somehow overlooked one crucial detail: warmth. Many troops lacked proper coats, socks, and sleeping gear. Blankets grew damp, boots stiffened, and men were left shivering in dugouts, desperate for anything to block the cold. That's when ingenuity took over. Some of the toughest soldiers discovered that survival didn't always come from steel or wool. Sometimes it came from yesterday's newspaper and a bit of ash from the campfire. Now, let's take a closer look at just how this unlikely combination of newspaper and ash actually worked to keep soldiers alive during those brutally cold winters. The science behind this hack is surprisingly simple but, incredibly effective. Newspaper creates pockets of air that trap body heat, while ash acts as an extra barrier against the wind and moisture. Together they formed a layer of insulation that could mean the difference between life and frostbite. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions are the ones that save lives. Desperation sparks innovation. With limited supplies, troops began stuffing newspapers under their shirts, inside trousers, and even into their boots. Soon, this practice spread like wildfire across front lines. The idea was simple: crumpled paper traps air, and still air keeps warmth in. Layer after layer of this so-called paper armor acted as a barrier against freezing winds. But some soldiers went a step further. They mixed in ash, the soft, powdery residue left from burned wood, with their paper stuffing. It might sound strange, but ash has an incredible property. It's a poor conductor of heat. That means it helps trap warmth instead of letting it escape. Combined, the mix of paper and ash created a surprisingly effective thermal layer, light enough to move in but warm enough to make the difference between frostbite and survival. Here's why this trick actually worked. Insulation doesn't come from thickness alone, it comes from trapped air. The tiny air pockets inside crumpled paper and grains of ash slowed the transfer of body heat into the freezing air. Blankets could do this too, but they were heavy, bulky, and often soaked through. Once wet, a wool blanket becomes useless. Paper, on the other hand, could be dried quickly or replaced easily. Imagine a soldier crouched in a trench, his uniform stiff with frost. He stuffs his jacket with sheets of old newspaper, presses ashes between layers of cloth, and suddenly feels a barrier forming between his body and the cold. Not comfort, but survival. This simple trick gave exhausted soldiers a fighting chance when the official winter gear never arrived. Life on the front lines, well, it was a constant test of endurance and adaptability. Soldiers faced not just the enemy, but also brutal conditions that pushed them to their limits. Whether it was bitter cold, lack of supplies, or the sheer exhaustion of battle, every day brought new challenges. Comparing the experiences of different armies, you start to see just how much their survival depended on ingenuity, quick thinking, and sometimes, pure luck. On both sides of the war, improvisation became a soldier's best friend. German troops on the Eastern Front were notorious for struggling against the Russian winter. Their supply chains stretched to breaking point. Many resorted to using anything that could trap heat. Straw, cloth, scraps, even pages torn from propaganda leaflets. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers, accustomed to the cold, sometimes used ash and paper inside their boots to keep their feet from freezing solid. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Reports from veterans describe the crunch of paper with every step, the faint smell of smoke clinging to their uniforms, and the rustle of improvised insulation beneath their coats. In the chaos of war, the crackle of a newspaper became the sound of survival. Strangely enough, in some situations, this makeshift insulation outperformed the army-issued blankets. Blankets were heavy and required constant drying. They were fine in camp, but useless on the move. Paper and ash could be replaced anywhere, scavenged from burned towns, old documents or leftover rations. They were light, flexible, and disposable. Soldiers could adjust their insulation as needed, adding layers for the night and discarding them during marches. Most importantly, this method insulated where it mattered most, around the chest and feet. You could wrap yourself in all the blankets you wanted, but if your boots were frozen, your body would soon follow. Paper stuffed inside footwear formed a protective shell, keeping warmth in and moisture out. In the battle between body heat and winter's bite, this low-tech hack won more often than anyone would think. But, not everything about this clever trick was a win. There were definitely some hard lessons learned along the way, and those memories stick with us. The soldiers who relied on paper for warmth had to balance creativity with the real risks and discomforts that came with it. It's a reminder of just how far people will go to survive, and how even the simplest solutions can leave a lasting mark. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Paper burns, and trenches weren't exactly free of open flames. A careless move near a stove could turn a soldier's insulation into a fire hazard. Wet conditions were another problem. Once soaked, the paper lost its fluff and turned into cold paste. And, let's be honest, it wasn't comfortable. The rustling sound, the itching, the smell of old ash, none of it screamed luxury. But when the alternative was freezing to death, soldiers didn't hesitate. What mattered was survival. Comfort was a luxury. Warmth was victory. This forgotten insulation tells us something profound about the human spirit during World War II. In the face of impossible odds, people found ways to adapt using the simplest materials imaginable. When the modern world broke down, ancient instincts took over, using fire, air, and ingenuity to stay alive. Today, scientists understand what those soldiers discovered by instinct. The most effective insulation isn't always high-tech. It's about trapping air, staying dry, and creating layers. Those same principles live on in modern cold-weather clothing and emergency survival gear. You could say those soldiers were early inventors of what we now call thermal layering. What makes this story so remarkable is that it reminds us how survival in war isn't just about who has the biggest guns or the fastest tanks. Sometimes, it's about who can stay warm long enough to keep fighting. Paper insulation may sound primitive, but for countless soldiers, it meant the difference between life and death. When you picture World War II, think beyond the battles and the uniforms. Think of the men sitting in the dark, wrapping newspapers around their legs, sprinkling ash into their coats, and daring the winter to take them. It's one of those quiet acts of ingenuity that history tends to forget. But it shouldn't. Because in those frozen trenches, survival wasn't about glory. It was about grit, creativity, and the will to make something out of nothing. So next time you hold a newspaper or brush ash from a fire, remember, once, these humble things saved lives on the world's deadliest front. If you love uncovering hidden stories like this, the resourcefulness, the resilience, the forgotten corners of World War II, make sure you subscribe to the Forgotten Warfronts, tap that notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how people endured.